Okay, hello and welcome to the Sprint 49 review. This is going to be a review of the last 3 weeks of efforts. Next slide, please. All right, as usual, I will go over the Sprint statistics. Carol will give us an update on the community. Dan will give us an update on the classic UI. Chris on the service UI. Adam will give us an update on the providers. Greg M on automate. Greg T on the platform. Alberto on the API. Dennis on performance. And Dave Johnson on quality engineering. Next slide. All right, so this sprint we had 354 pull requests merged on the main repo. As you can see, more than half, 184, are bug fixes. Only 54 are enhancements, and that is because we are in stabilization mode for getting the OIWA release out the door. Next slide, please. Out of those 354 pull requests, over 162 have been backported to OIWA. Most of those, the vast majority, are bugs, with some refactoring and some small sprinkling of enhancements coming in very last minute. Next slide, please. If we do the breakdown by feature category, the classic UI got almost half. The providers got 79 pull requests. That's a pretty common theme. And the others kind of are all sorted out there. On the providers, also kind of good mix, 19 from the middleware team on Hawkular, 10 on the containers, 13 on Rev, and 16 on OpenStack. Next slide. All right, this is our view of the last 10 sprints. So the numbers are kind of growing higher. If we go from when Darga was about to go GA, and that's or Darga RC, so the numbers are higher. The bug fixes are higher. So it's a good trend in the right direction here. Next slide. All right. So on the main repo, we had 354 pull requests merged, but in total, we had 592 pull requests merged across all the repos that we're working with over the last 3 weeks. The main one that got a lot of attention was the integration tests run by the QE team. The service UI got 35. The website got 14. And then Amazon and Azure got 12 and 9 respectively. Next slide, please. All right, I'll turn it over to Carol to give us an update on the community.
All right, thanks, Oleg. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so this is Carol, and I'll give a short update on the community side. One of the main things is the website. I think I did not present last sprint, but we released the website on October 10th, which is 5 weeks ago, and I've been monitoring the traffic and metrics on the site, and with very encouraging results. We have almost in the first couple of weeks more than doubled the number of visits in the same periods, and over the past month or so, average we have more than we have 82% more page views than the previous forward period. And kind of narrowing, going more into the type of page views, I also noticed that almost half the page views are to the documentation and the sub pages under that, and which is a lot more higher percentage compared to previously as well. And I think with the new kind of interface, making it easier to access and find the documentation, and also the new getting started guides that proved pretty probably quite helpful, and people have been checking out those documentation. So thanks to everyone who has been contributing, and of course, I'm sure the regular blog posts like the last week in ManageIQ have been contributing to the additional views as well. Next slide, please. All right. Okay, I see a comment that some actual numbers on the page views. I will do that for the next sprint. So I'll have more like concrete numbers for those who are interested. So now on to more like other stuff. In addition to the website, we have a couple of events that happened recently last week, KubeCon and RubyConf in Seattle and Cincinnati, respectively. Jerome was there at KubeCon with demoing ManageIQ at the Red Hat booth, and Chris presented deletion-driven development, even though it's not really like a ManageIQ topic, but I think he used ManageIQ as an example in many of his demos. So. Then upcoming events, it's actually both on beginning of next year, the DevConf in Brno and FOSDEM in Brussels on this side of the pond this time. And many of you have already emailed me saying, like the proposals or the CFPs you have submitted for these events. If you have, if those of you who have others, more talks and activities related to ManageIQ, please let me know so we can coordinate like a cohesive presence and promote ManageIQ at these events together. The voting for the next release, the F release, is ongoing. John has made the poll and also got some statistics from the past voting efforts, and it's really great to see more and more people are contributing and participating in these. And we, at this moment, we have 70 votes, 69 voting with the options and 1 write-in. So, and we have 3 more days including today to go. So, and I think it is currently is quite a close gap between Fisher and Fine. So, every vote counts. Go vote if you haven't already. So, looking at metrics for the website and voting and stuff like that, I also decided to share a summary of the metrics I've collected. I do weekly collection of metrics, but this is more like a general past 6 months. We've been seeing consistent increases in participation, number of users, and so on. Of course, we would like to see more, but at least it's quite encouraging to see, the growth is constantly going upwards. So, all right, that's all from me. Next slide, please.
Hey, this is Dan. All right, so on the UI side, quite a few PRs merged, obviously a ton of them. And if you just look at the stats, I mean, mostly bugs. So, however, we did get a few enhancements in. Some of the teams got enhancements in, and we are continuing on our tech debt refactoring projects and actually trying to almost get completed with a couple of them. To kind of summarize some of the bug fixes, there was a lot of charting and topology and toolbar button cleanups. I could probably throw timelines in there as well, where some of these, a lot of these pieces were replaced, and so we had a lot of initial bugs to clean up with that. There were some regressions from the VM tree changes, where we now default to not show the VM nodes in the trees, and that caused some issues because a lot of times the code was dependent on the actual tree selection of the virtual machine. So been cleaning those up. And And I-18N updates always, especially when we're trying to get close to a release, trying to get all of the internationalization in, and then just a ton of e-release fixes, just in various places, because we've done a lot of refactoring in the past, and a lot of that is coming up in this release as well. Next slide. On the TechDebt side, we did get rid of the old chart and timeline code, so those are totally replaced now and don't exist in the code base. Some deduplication PRs, more to come on that, but we're trying to hit some of the main places where we can get rid of the duplication. Really looking forward to some of the splits that are coming up and things where we don't want to, have to deal with this as we go through those projects. Toolbars, I started listing them and then I gave up because I was typing too many of them in, but we're 25 out of 31 completed. I suspect that we'll be finishing that project soon and can move on to some other refactoring projects. On the enhancement side, I just kind of dug through and found a few that got added. I've got a few screenshots, so let's just do the next slide. So in OpenStack now, the host aggregates, you can now assign a host to a host aggregate and of course remove that host as well. So I think this was just kind of a missed feature that they wanted to sneak in, and it wasn't too big, so we got that in. Next slide. On the container side, I think this was just really missed, but with the number of containers that a lot of users have, we really want to make sure that you could do the search on them because there's just sometimes thousands of them. So we got that added in. And the next slide. And Containers Group added a label to tag mapping screen. So you're able to, based on the container entity, in other words, the type, like a pod or whatever, actually map one of their labels to a tag inside ManageIQ, and the label values actually will become the actual tags within those categories. So kind of cool. We might be able to expand this in the future to other things that have labels, but right now, I guess since the container stuff all has labels, we're able to do this, and it just automatically happens as things are discovered. That's it on the UI side. Chris?
Thanks, Dan. Good morning, everyone. So for the service UI, we have, as Oleg pointed out, about 35 PRs. Of those, 18 were some pretty significant bug fixes. We've resolved a lot of the technical debt that we've been accumulating over the course of time that the service UI has existed. Focusing a lot on unit tests, we're up to about 59% test coverage. Some of the kind of major highlights, we added Yarn for dependency management. We've removed Bower, the use of Bower, as it was kind of falling out of style and packages weren't getting added to that. And we've also added the power operations for VMs. And that's it for me. Next slide.
All right, thanks, Chris. So there's a lot going on the provider side. The majority of it were bugs fixed, but there were a couple notable enhancements that I pulled out. But it should be noted, almost every provider had at least one PR merged in this sprint, so a lot of work going on across the board. Next slide, please. So the Hawkular team led all the providers with 19 PRs merged. 18 of them were bug fixes, and I think 3 were blockers. So a lot of work going there, and the enhancement they added was to allow you to overwrite, basically force deploy over an existing deployment. So that's good. Next slide. The Red Hat virtualization team had a lot of, probably the most enhancements of all the providers merged. So last sprint, Gregg mentioned they enhanced targeted refresh when adding a new VM. That ended up getting used here. They noticed that when you're doing a provision of a VM, it was kicking off a new full refresh, and we could just use the work that was done last sprint to reduce that from, on a large QE environment, provisioning was reduced from 17 minutes to 1 minute, so a nice enhancement there. They also added live migration support and the ability to import VMs to Rev from VMware. Next slide. OpenStack added the gnocchi metric service that was split off of Ceilometer, and so we added support for that this sprint, as well as on the network manager side, there is backend support for creating floating IPs using the task queue, and shortly should expect to see that come up in the UI. Next slide. Amazon Lattice has been working on the data transfer object refresh, and he moved the Cloud Manager refresh for Amazon over to this new method. So this is expecting to make saving much more efficient, and so this is a good way of testing that out. And so now Cloud Manager refresh is using the new DTO saving methods. Next slide. Probably the big news here is Azure was split out, and it joins Lenovo and Amazon as providers that are hosted outside of the main repository. So a lot of work went into that, and it's great to see this moving along, and it'll be good to see what the next one is as well. Next slide. Lenovo, there's still a lot of initial PRs coming in, but the one that I saw that was interesting was the initial refresh code is starting to work. So it's not running in a worker yet, but they're really getting the physical server refresh parsing code starting to work soon. So that's next slide. For vCloud, we had added events in previous sprints, but you had to add the RabbitMQ credentials using the Rails console, and in the past sprint, the external XLab team added a way for you to add those credentials in the UI. So obviously a much better user experience there. Next slide. And finally, 3 more pluggable providers supported mix-in methods got moved over from the old validates methods to support. And as part of this, I remember we cleaned up a couple other areas of code that we noticed when we were going through and doing this refactoring weren't needed, so we got to delete some code from doing this refactoring as well, which is always nice. And next slide, and that's it. Over to Greg M.
Cool. Thanks, Adam. So probably be surprised to hear that we had a lot of bug fixes this sprint, but there were some enhancements we got in. So the first one around service models, just exposing EMS events directly off of the VMs and the templates. We had a user that was looking for events on a newly created VM by looking at all the events on the provider and trying to find the ones for the VM in question, and just thousands of events as opposed to like 8 for the new VM. So much more convenient, efficient to do it that way. Notifications, we did big in the last sprint review going over the enhancement that was added. We needed to add support for exposing the tenant and global audiences to that. So that came in this sprint. And then just for services, we were working with the service UI to expose the power buttons on the service as well as the power states for the service. And that initial PR got merged. There's still some work to do around that to make it a little bit more efficient. So hoping to get that in this current sprint. Next slide, please. So for orchestration, a couple things. If stock failures occurred, for Azure, we were kind of losing the details just in the logs. There was no way to see in the UI what happened or why it went wrong. So we were able to kind of find that data and calculate it up to the stack so that you can see those error messages without having to find the exact logging that will point you to what's going on. So that's very, very useful. And then for deployments, we weren't sending the template to the proper zone. We were not honoring the zone of the provider that the template was being deployed to. We've got that in, and then from the VM, the way services link, usually a service connects directly to a VM, but here it connects to the stack and then the VM. So the VM didn't have visibility back to the service that it was connected to. Got that in as well. Next slide. And we have a couple notable fixes I wanted to go through. One, we talked about the scheduling automate that was added in the last sprint. Very similar to the simulate screen. We found that the key pair attributes that you can pass on those screens were not coming through the same as they do from simulate. So obviously if you're testing your scripts in simulate and then go to make a schedule out of it, it wouldn't work as expected. So we got that cleaned up. And then from MIQ group, the service dialogues in automate automatically exposed a filter attribute due to some back-end remodeling that result and move to a different object. And so we were just able to map that within the service model so that you get the exact same results back. So somebody was running into a failure there, and it's an easy cleanup, but wanted to note that. Next slide. And then finally, there's a number of fixes around the Git automate integration that we talked about last time. The two that we kind of wanted to point out was one, we started playing, initially taking the export of domain and automate and pushing that into a Git repo. So you'd always have the directory for the repo and then the directory where the domain was stored in the domain file. We wanted to be able to support, obviously, getting rid of that first level domain. So we fixed that in this sprint, that you don't need kind of those examples there, that kind of 2 levels of directories before you can get to have the domain defined within a repository. And then just some refresh cleanup around contents and the references. That was not happening. So if people are seeing that, fixed in the latest sprint release. So awesome. And that's it for automate. Who's next?
Greg T.
All right. Okay. So we also worked on a lot of bugs. I decided to put a chart up here instead of putting some numbers so you could see it was mostly bugs. We do have some enhancements there, and there's some technical debt.
Why are your bugs blue?
Because I couldn't figure out how to make it red. And it wasn't worth it.
More approachable.
Yeah. They're softer bugs. And they've been resolved.
Now they're blue.
Okay, so we did have some fixes and enhancements in central admin, chargeback appliance, and high availability for Postgres. So next slide, please. Okay, so on the central admin side, thanks to Brandon, who's sitting right next to me, we actually fixed the bug that was preventing the service template provisioning from working end to end. There was an issue with the way the shopping carts, the service order instances, really not getting created on the remote region, and there's a dependency there. So it kind of had to be tweaked a bit by Brandon. We got that taken care of. And also we fixed something Nick did on the reconfigure. The routing wasn't working quite right, so now it's properly routing the requests down to the proper remote regions, and it's creating a separate request for each region as it should. All right, next slide. A couple of smaller things in chargeback. Last sprint we added back the weekly and monthly rates. I think we missed the daily ones, so those are there now. So now you can specify daily rates. And Shimon has been doing a bunch of refactoring in chargeback in preparation for some of the work he's going to be doing. And one of the things is a benefit from that is simplifying the rates editor, because it was a bit ambiguous, where if you had a fixed rate tier, there were variable rate entries that he disabled. It kind of was confusing. Next slide, please. So on the appliance side, LJ increased a bunch of defaults, memory thresholds for the workers. I listed them all out there. That's to prevent, there were some cases where workers were getting recycled prematurely and too often because the thresholds were a bit low. One of the reasons for that is the newer Ruby and the generational garbage collection requires more memory for these workers. So couple of these were just like right at the threshold and kind of teetering around there. And thanks to Joe V, he added a feature to configure the number of saved log file rotations. So I threw in a quick screenshot there in the appliance console. So you can see there I had 14, and I was going to set it to 28, although I probably don't have enough space for that, so I didn't submit that. Next slide, please. Okay, and in higher availability, we added, this was on our to-do list at the end of the work we did for the e-release, to be able to raise an EVM event when we actually do a failover. And then that could be hooked into policy and automate and alerting and things like that. Thank you, Yuri, for that one. Next slide, I think that might be it. Yep, I'll turn it over to Alberto for the rest.
Thanks, Greg. So on the API side, we have work from Martin B. from the ref team. So he added the import VM action on providers. So that's implemented, generically on the API side, leveraging the model. So currently, the model supports importing VMware VMs onto Rev. And here's an example snippet on targeting the Rev provider and doing an import VM where to import it from. You have the href of the source VM and some of the target to use from cluster data store and all that fun stuff. So that was a good enhancement. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have a couple of enhancements from Alon. He's enhanced the API policies to support the full CRUD actions. So here showing an example on creating a policy and as well as the standard, the edit actions on single resources, the bulk edits, as well as the delete action, the HTTP verb, and the bulk deletes. So that's for API policies. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, Alon also did the CRUD actions on API conditions. So we have an example here on creating a sample condition here, and also we're providing the edits and the deletes action on single resources and bulk actions. Next slide, please. All right. Also from Alon, we have a new collection. We're exposing the API actions. So again, we have the full CRUD here. We have the create. Obviously, the queries first. So the standard queries. So get API actions, individual resource. We also support the bulk query when you do a post on API actions. Here, sample create, and also providing the edits and the deletes. Next slide, please. All right, we've enhanced the API requests to support. So when requests are not auto-approved, we provide now the approve and deny actions on those request resources, and the same can also be applied on bulk, and that's used by the central admin. Off to next slide, please. All right, so we have a couple of enhancements from Jillian. So one thing we had to do here was enhance the querying of the content of the service dialogues to return additional attributes, because that was needed by the service UI. So things like ID and other attributes are now returned, as you see here as an example. Next slide, please. Okay, so another enhancement from Jillian was providing a copy action on service dialogues. So that would allow copying the service dialogues and the full tree below as another service dialogue. Default behavior is you'll see the label of the new service dialogue called copy of, but that can be specified via the label parameter as shown in the example here. The post action on individual single resources as well as bulk copies is provided. Next slide, please. Okay, also an enhancement from Jillian. We are now providing the delete action on service requests. So deleting via the post on the service request resource via the HTTP action as well as bug deletes. And that's it for APIs. Next slide, please.
Okay, so excuse me. At the beginning of the sprint, we kind of anticipated kind of helping out across teams. Everyone's pushing hard to get the e-release across the goal line, and that in fact was the case. A lot of time was spent across teams. One of the big goals we had for this sprint was to get a gem out for helping collect metrics, performance metrics, and analyzing performance metrics. Nick did the heavy lifting on this and got us a nice shiny new MIQ performance gem with lots of input from Keenan. There are pretty big plans for extending this functionality as we go forward. Got a nice start, and we look forward to going on. The gem will be used in the creation of automated performance regression testing, which we don't have today, but is getting closer on the horizon. Nick will be talking a little bit about this gem and kind of introduce it. You may have picked up from some of the earlier slides that provider refresh has been getting a lot of attention on performance. Kudos to the Rev team for getting the targeted refresh in, and Cloud Manager for moving to DTO. Lattice and Keenan worked on what was a small change to save inventory and refresh, but it was a significant impact on performance. Keenan will be talking about some of these performance improvements in a minute. But now I'll hand it off to Nick to introduce the new MIQ performance gem. Next slide, please.
Good morning. Hopefully you all can hear me, but I'll get started anyway. So ManageIQ Performance, or as it previously was known as the artist formerly known as MIQ Performance, we changed it when we switched to the ManageIQ organization, just for consistency. This started off as kind of a thing that I needed personally, because I, a couple months ago, was tasked to get metrics on flow pages for all of the routes on the application. If you've ever done a rake routes and counted the number of routes we actually have in MIQ, it's actually somewhere around 3,000. So I gave up pretty quick on that. So for me, this is very much about automating and collecting of metrics found in the application, specifically things like SQL queries and stuff like that, time it takes for a request to happen, and even providing extra analytics for profiling, given that we need that for particular things. So and allowing us to debug when something is slow. Things have existed like this before, so I may have done the old snafu of reinventing the wheel, but this is very much borrowing heavily from Rack Mini Profiler, a lot of things that Alex has done in the CMSE performance repo. And it's more, and plenty of things that Keenan has done on his own in his perf utilities repo. This is very much combining those all together, putting them in one spot, and hopefully making it so that it's very cohesive and something that can be used by everyone. So you're only learning one tool chain instead of having to learn it for a specific use case, and very much trying to unify that and making it the, I don't know if gold standard is the right word, but that's the best I can come with right now. For that, it had a couple of goals. Mostly, I wanted a very modular, configurable, very much available to handle tasks given the various situation. I wanted to be used by all facets of the organization. I wanted QE to be able to use it, obviously our performance team, but also the QE performance team when they're running simulations and doing very much heavy workloads on our application stress testing. I want developers to very much be able to use this, as well as support, so they can very much troubleshoot issues as they come in from Bugzilla tickets and such like that. So that was a big goal, and along with that, just trying to make it lightweight and automatable as well. So I will probably kind of go through some of the basics of it real quick, and hopefully I'll give you kind of an idea of what it does. Next slide, please. So a key aspect of this gem is the middleware that gets injected into the application. By default, it is inactive, and you actually have to pass it a header, the one that I have there with the with performance monitoring, for it to actually activate and trigger the middleware. The middleware itself is kind of a wrapper for a bunch of other collection plugins. I call them middlewares themselves. I might rename them to middleware plugins, but for now, that's what they are. So this is simple things like the kind of active support information that you see in the logs, time taken in the views, time taken in active record, and total time, which request was taken, as well as similar active record data that you may have seen from Keenan in the past when doing performance stuff. This is borrowed heavily from things that we've contributed to React Mini Profiler. So this is the number of queries that have been triggered, the amount of time it has taken in SQL, the number of rows returned, and other things that are configurable is like a stack trace for each one of those queries that have been profiled. And so we keep data for both of those. Assuming you have StackProf installed, it also will enable that and then allow for profiling of the request that you've done, and then save that data off to a file somewhere. This is also meant to be very configurable, so any of those plugins that I've just mentioned are very much, can be enabled, disabled, depending on the situation. So if we were to run this in a QE environment, this would be something that would very much be, you'd want to disable stack profiling, because those can get into the multiple megabytes, hundreds of megabytes really, on long requests. So you can also configure to have multiple storage backends. So by default, we have a file and a log backend. Those currently are the two that are available, but file is very much for very long, hefty data per request. Getting as most amount of profiling data as you can, whereas the log is very much a very short one-line summary of everything that you've gotten. Good for running it all the time on every request, and then making sure that you can then figure out which requests need to be revisited. So we also have a browser mode kind of wrapper middleware as well. This is not included with the base one, but this allows for kind of the features you'd see in maybe React Mini Profiler, where you can access it via URL param, or just configure the middleware to always be on. And all of this is very much configurable through middleware or through a YAML file, and can be configured further, probably through a DSL in the future. Next slide, please. So along with this middleware, I've also included a pretty hefty CLI interface. And this is very much going back to my original use case for it, was that I needed to be able to quickly allow for testing against a particular URL or a bunch of URLs. So kind of the simplest one is just the benchmark command, which, as you can see below, is just hitting a particular URL. I'm hitting it 5 times, and I'm getting I'm having it inject that header every time that it's done, logging it automatically for you, and allowing you to hit that multiple times and get data on it in succession. Along with that, we also include something called a request file. The request file, next slide, please. I'll go into it further. Is a rake task, and it can automatically generate it based off of the routes file. This is meant to be a quick way to determine all the routes that we need to hit, and kind of allow for future proofing, being able to run a suite against our entire application and get an idea of which routes are slowly improving, slowly regressing, having regressions on them in performance wise. And you can run it on the last slide. You could just add the -- request file instead of a URL, and this will then read from that file and execute that. This doesn't hit every round of the application, because posts are mostly used for kind of updating data and stuff like that. So this doesn't handle passing in URL data. The posts you're seeing there are special routes that are particularly just for kind of getting around URL constraints of max limit size. And so it's just hitting those routes where There may be data associated with it, there may not, but most of the ones are not create or edit or update routes. This obviously can be generated manually, but there is the rake task available for doing this automated as well. So next slide, please. So once you have all that data, we want to have some kind of reporting on it as well. You've probably seen tables that Keenan has put in some of the slides. So I've provided a way of quickly taking the data that you've gathered and then being able to quickly do an analysis on it. So given the benchmark from 2 slides ago, this would kind of give you a quick overview of the amount of time it took, the number of queries executed, the number of rows returned from that particular route. It also gives, by doing multiple in succession, it gets kind of it highlights outliers and kind of shows you very simply when things are there. So with this first one, obviously it was just after the server had started, so it's still initializing and auto loading some classes, which added an extra 2 seconds to the request. This is very helpful and very nice to have when you're trying to do this manually, where you just click in a browser and it's very monotonous. You wait 2 seconds, you switch tabs or something. So being able to quickly automate this very much speeds up the process. Next slide, please. And finally, the last command that this also provides out of the box right now is an analyze command. This is specifically for StackProf, but I have one command at the top there, which kind of gives you a real quick overview of kind of the top bad actors in a particular request. So in this case, the block and sprockets resolve was pretty bad. So if you look at the kind of final command at the bottom, you can pass it in a method, and what it'll do is allow you to walk through the stack and determine where actually in the application this is getting called, and allow you to very easily determine which is your bad actor from your application side and not just from the gems that you're using. With this, StackProf is not a direct dependency, so you're not required to have it. And that's kind of another goal of the project, is that it provides these tools for you, but will gracefully degrade without it. Next slide, please. So shortly we will be releasing this on Ruby Gems, but there's a lot of other things that we plan on doing with it. We want to have more plugins, memory specifically, but also method profiling, simper timers, allowing to, as I just mentioned, profile specific methods and get precise metrics on that. Right now we just have the log and file storage backends, but we'd like to expand that. The performance team, when they're doing their workloads, use StatsD a lot. They're also big fans of ELK, so we'd like to support those as well, possibly Redis and others. Obviously, the reporting we have is very simplified, and we'd like to expand upon it further, and a whole bunch of other things that I'm not going to list off. But we'd very much like user feedback on this. So if you're developing on ManageIQ, please take a look at the performance gem next time you're building out a feature, and let us know how it works. Thanks. Next slide.
So you understand the tools we're using. So what are some of the things we can do with the tools? This past sprint, I've been focusing on making relationships better, which everybody's probably heard enough of my relationship jokes there. But what exactly are relationships? And for the most part in our application, we have EMSs, which have folders, and those end up at VMs. And these are across different models. So it's a little tricky to map out these relationships, sometimes from genealogy, what template did this VM come from, or maybe it's just the hierarchy in general. So this is used in like the tree views, it's used in graph views, it's used on the left-hand nav bar. And so the relationships are really used all over the product. First thing off is we got we worked with the author of Ancestry, and we now have commit privileges over there. So it hadn't really been updated in 2.5 years, and we've got 3 releases out of Ancestry as well. Some little changes, just changing I like to like. Basically, we're showing 10% improvement right across the board. So that is gaining, little minor enhancements. It's nice to see that across the board. The numbers I'm showing here is for show folders, so it's like a graph view. This will make our improvements to relationships. It will actually show the numbers. When we're building trees, we just have some minor changes. For like virtual associations, we've converted them across to just standard. And the goal around this is just downloading less data. So we can see that using scopes for Ancestry, just for hosts related to storages, right there alone saved us on a page that took 2 seconds. It saved us almost half a second, 520 rows coming back. So the end goal is showing a basic folder that's getting us from 2 seconds and 63% faster down to 700 seconds. But if you notice the number of queries, besides our count stars going down, the number of queries are similar or the same. So this is just tuning we're doing on modifying the filters. We're filtering objects before they come back. And we're basically doing the same logic behind the scenes, but as we can see the number of rows, we're pulling back 88% fewer rows. So just really tuning these values coming back for relationships. Next slide, Mary, please. So the good old-fashioned VM Explorer. Notice here to highlight again, queries 130 down to 128. So we're in theory doing the same amount of work. And but we do notice that 92% fewer rows are coming back, and it happens to be 90% faster. So again, for working with relationships, we're just filtering before we're bringing the data back, and then also taking advantage of some of the tuning for the Ancestry gem that we're putting in there. We're introducing odd cases like my great-grandparent happens to be this. It saved 50% on one screen. So it's nice to be able to manipulate, or not manipulate, I guess, to add to the community over in the Ancestry gem side, and also just move forward. Okay, next slide, next person.
Hey, how's it going? Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, cool, thanks. So a lot of bug fixing going on this past sprint, so that's been great. Thank you. We need more of that. A lot of bug fixing means a lot of bug verification on QE side, so that's been ongoing and continues to be. There's concern on QE in terms of the number of open issues and the rate of the incoming bugs. So we've been working with the leadership team trying to address that. Significant effort going into retriaging the current issue list, and just trying to focus on the items that affect quality, from the user perspective. If you were to break down the current list of issues, some 25% are high impact and high severity issues, and we need to see that number decrease, right, to increase the quality of the overall project. Over the course of this past sprint, a lot of test cases, some 2,000 test cases have been run. For the most part, 80% of them are passing. The 10% are kind of lower priority test cases, regression tests. Ultimately, we need to be running those more often, and we're working to increase our velocity with regards to some of these issues or some of these tests that have not been run. Next slide. Automation-wise, we've been running into infinite spinners in the automation, so that's been a problem that we've been fighting and trying to figure out and gain some understanding on. It's not just the test automation that is hitting it. There are some open issues that have been resolved already with regards to the infinity spinnies, but that's ongoing, a ongoing headache that we've been working through. Nav-mazing conversion, the navigation framework, we're roughly 50% of the way through that. A lot more focus has been on the testing side here lately in the last couple sprints. We hope to get back to more automation refactoring over the course of the next few sprints. Next slide. Breakdown of the PRs for this release. Bunch of bug fixes, a bunch of infrastructure-related fixes, and framework. So a lot of work going on the test automation side. Next slide.
All right. I guess one more thing of note, and that is that we are working on the final build of the OIWA release. Hopefully that's coming in the next few days. Jason will send out a notification when that lands. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for their input and their work on the sprint, and for preparing the slides and talking about things. And would like to open it up for questions or comments. All right. I don't see any in the chat. I'm not hearing any on the phone. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll see you all in 3 weeks. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
See ya.